So here we are for episode, believe it or not, count them, eight.
Eight.
Episode 8 for
Hard to
Footnote
believe.
Valley History. This is Nancy Sarles in front of you. I'm Richard Adams, and we're here. That's all I have to say. So we had someone not call in, but send in a message about.
Yeah, we're
whiskey.
thinking that it's about whiskey. And actually, recently I found we knew there were a lot of distilleries and a lot of people were making whiskey at home or commercially, and I've recently found 2 more that people have contacted me about, but this one I think was triggered by our whiskey
Rebellion. Yeah.
Whiskey Rebellion. So it was the lady in Stewart's Draft, Sabrina Almerode. Thank you, Sabrina. Contacted me and said she was cleaning out a house in Stewart's Draft and she found a whiskey bottle. It was Yellowstone whiskey, and it said it was bottled by a distiller in Stanton, S.A. Day, D-A-Y. And I'd never heard of that distiller, so I just did a little scrounging around in the newspapers and found out that he was kind of late in the game. He and another fellow tried to open a distillery in Stanton, right about where under the underpass. If you go under the underpass, you see Columbia Gas, right in there. And about 1914, so this is just like a year before Virginia goes dry with Prohibition. But
Scandal. It was a scandal.
It was a scandal. The people protested against it. There were some people who really supported it, but people were protesting against it because it would reduce the ethics of the neighborhood. Right. And so, this is at the base of Gospel Hill. So I guess there was some real concern that it would reduce the ethics. But anyway, apparently the judge refused to listen to the people who were complaining, and he granted them the license. I guess it would have been, they would have had to shut down about a year later. So short-lived, and that's probably why we never heard of it. But long enough to get his name on the label of some liquor. So
maybe they were getting on the B&O Railroad, heading down to Lexington, taking the liquor down there.
Maybe there, or maybe taking it north to Baltimore.
Taking it to Baltimore. Could have been. So it could have been, yeah. So anyway, well, thank you, Sabrina. As my brother would say, there was a Mr. Almerode that had a service station right there at the crossroads of Stewart's Draft. I think it's where the Exxon station is, right across from that church.
Right.
Across from the bank. And he had some kind of car. My brother had an old A model or something. And my brother came up from Danville, wanted to meet Mr. Almerode. That's what he called him. Anyway.
Well, Almerode's a good Augusta County name.
That's a good Augusta County name. So, all right. So today we're going to talk about Lewis and Clark and Nancy.
Lewis and Clark and their connections, which there are multiple connections with Stanton and Augusta County and the Shenandoah Valley. It's pretty interesting. So just to remind those people who haven't had their history lessons in a while, the Lewis and Clark expedition is really probably one of the most American defining events that took place in our history since we became a nation. And it was one of the events that was not a war. A lot of times we define ourselves by wars or bad things that happened. This was a great thing that happened that brought the nation together, as we'll talk about. And it was a military expedition. A lot of people don't realize that. It was a military expedition, but it was not. It was a peaceful, scientific exploration. The group that went out called themselves the Corps of Discovery. So what precipitated the Lewis and Clark expedition? It was the Louisiana Purchase. As you might remember, America started as 13 colonies kind of clinging to the Atlantic coast. And then gradually we moved westward. So we picked up states like Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and then up north like Maine and things like that. But we were landlocked between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean until the early 1800s.
Okay, and just give me so I can kind of do the flying map thing. Where did it start and where did it end?
Okay, well, let's just talk about the Louisiana Purchase and kind of what happened. Okay. So being landlocked, we didn't have control of the Mississippi River, and so that's what we were looking for, is trying to get control of the Mississippi River, St. Louis to New Orleans, so that we could, because once you get into the Appalachian Mountains, then the waters flow to the Ohio River and to the Mississippi River.
Right.
So if we were going to trade and be a world-class trading power, we needed to get our goods from west of the Allegheny Mountains out to the rest of the world. And so we needed the Mississippi River. So the negotiations were with France, who had control of that portion of land and the Mississippi River. The negotiations are really pretty simple to try to get control, or at least some bargaining power in New Orleans and the Mississippi River. And surprisingly, in the negotiations, France, who had recently acquired the territory that was called the Louisiana Territory, because New Orleans is in Louisiana, and that's the southernmost part of that is Louisiana, the state of Louisiana today. France, surprisingly, they kind of got tired of having control of this big tract of land in the New World, and they said, how much for the whole thing? And the whole thing being, half of the western United States, from Mississippi, halfway out. And so America wasn't prepared for that, but they jumped on the opportunity. So for just a few $1 million, we doubled our size by buying the Louisiana Territory. So it goes really from the mouth of the Mississippi down in New Orleans, and then kind of spreads out in a fan going west. And we'll throw up maps for you to see this, but went to the western, north and western reaches were kind of unclear because we'd never really been out there. Some people said it went to the Pacific Ocean. England would have disagreed with that. But anyway, Jefferson was president. He jumped on it, bought it, probably illegally, because we'd never done something like that before. But just instantly we doubled the size of our country and had to figure out what to do with it and what was out there. And they were hoping that they would find the fabled Northwest Passage, which is a way to sail across the country from Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
Waterways and get out on the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
You can't do that. Way up in Canada, people were always looking for the Northwest Passage too. And ironically, now because of climate change and the melting of the Arctic, there is a Northwest Passage for the first time in recorded history.
You go to Seattle. Go to Portland.
So did this go to Portland?
Well, the Northwest Passage.
Northwest Passage is way up in the Arctic Circle now. We realized once we'd mapped the country and knew Canada and knew the United States, the search for the Northwest Passage went way up into the Arctic. Okay. And it was never there because the Arctic, at least by boat, you could traverse it, on land. Right. But it was never there because it was frozen solid. And now, because of climate change, there is actually a Northwest Passage. But that's, getting off in the weeds, as we often do. Okay.
All right. So keep going. And what year was the purchase?
Okay. The purchase was 1803, I think.
1803,
maybe 1802. But it was very, very early in the 19th century. So Jefferson jumps right on this, and he sees an opportunity to send out an expedition to explore this, look for the Northwest Passage, but also to see what kind of territory we just grabbed up. And you got to realize that he needed to lock up, the nation needed to lock up this territory and claim it as our own, because America was really just all along the East Coast, and anything out on the other side of the Alleghenies, much less the Mississippi, was outside of our reach almost. There were only, when the Louisiana Purchase happened, there were only 4 roads from one side of the Alleghenies, which is the Shenandoah Valley and all up and down, north and south from there, to the other side. There were only 4 roads that got you out to places like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Kentucky, and they were all bad. And so America, there were 5.3 million people in America at that time, and almost all of them were within 50 miles of the coast.
Okay.
So, and I should also say that of those 5.3 million people, 20% of them, 1 person in 5, was an enslaved person.
Okay.
So there was actually talk by the settlers who were out across the Alleghenies, who were out in those far reaches. There was talk of becoming a new nation, and it was easier to trade between Boston and London than Boston and Ohio.
Okay.
That's how
bad it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So our mindset was all that country from the Alleghenies and west to the Mississippi, and then west to the great unknown was considered, it was called the back country. And because our backs were to it, we faced the old world. We faced England, we faced Europe, and all our trade was that way across the Atlantic Ocean. And that was what our ties were. Our ties weren't to the back country. It was considered, a savage wilderness. So what this Corps of Discovery did, as you'll find out as we're talking, is it reshaped America's mindset so that we turned ourselves from facing east as a nation to facing west, and sort of began thinking about, hey, maybe we could be a nation coast to coast. We could be the whole, the bulk of the continent, and rather than this little country that was right along the coast. So after the Lewis and Clark expedition, the word frontier, meaning front, not the area, became the front instead of the back. And so it changed our whole mindset of what America was and what America could become. So we have this land. Jefferson is just hot as can be to explore it and kind of claim it for us. So he gets this idea, he's going to form a military expedition with the fledgling U.S. Army to go out and explore it. So they set off. He picks the person to lead the expedition is going to be his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis. And Meriwether Lewis had been in the Army, not in the Revolution because he was too young, but in the years after, in the Indian Wars and sort of opening up in Ohio River Valley and those places. And Meriwether Lewis had served in the Army, and then he was now Jefferson's personal secretary. So he picked him, and then Meriwether Lewis picked a friend of his who he had served in the Army with, William Clark. And I've got an ad. And so then they were told to assemble a group of people. And so they started assembling who they would need. And they all, a lot of them had military rank. There were people who were in the military, and then there were other people who were attached as scouts and things like that they would pick up later. But they advertised down in Kentucky in the back country, because that's where they knew they needed seasoned people who could shoot a gun, who could hunt, who had experience with the Native Americans, who could survive in the wilderness, basically. And they ran an ad, and the ad said they wanted good hunters, stout, healthy, unmarried, accustomed to the woods, and capable of bearing bodily fatigue to a considerable degree. And should any young man answering this description be found in your neighborhood, I would thank you to give information of them on my arrival at the Falls of the Ohio, and if possible, learn the probability of engaging them in this service. So they were to be paid $5 a month if they were enlisted men, and $25 a month if they were officers. So they started recruiting, and
plus room and board.
Plus room and board, yeah, but they had to hunt that themselves. So that's what there were preparations that were happening in multiple places. So they were recruiting a lot in Kentucky, which was the edge of America, right, and right in the wilderness. Yeah, it was a jumping off point to no man's land. So a number of them came out of Kentucky. In fact, they were called the nine men from Kentucky. So including our buddy John Coulter. But let me just say, and then Jefferson, to prepare for this, he took Meriwether Lewis and he sent him up to Philadelphia. And he said, you need to get some training if you're going to do this. You need to learn how to use a chronometer and a sextant so you can map, so you can get longitude and latitude and create maps, because this area hadn't been mapped before. You need to map it. You need to go to a doctor and get some medical training, because you're going to be out there in the middle of nowhere. And so that's a whole interesting side part about the medical stuff. But he spoke to some physicians and learned some advice on things to do, much of which they didn't take that advice, because there were things like you should wash your feet in cold water every morning, and that will get your constitution going. And they just didn't do that. They should also said if your feet have gotten chilled, you should rinse them off in spirits, which would be liquor. And they didn't do that either, mostly probably because they didn't want to waste good liquor.
Don't waste the liquor.
They also said the doctor told him if you're overly fatigued, like you've marched hard on one day, or you've pulled your boats upstream in a river all day, that you should lay prone for 2 hours, and that will be better than any other kind of relaxation. And they didn't do that either.
They didn't do that. Kept walking.
But they also took he learned about herbs, and they packed a lot of medicines from the time, a lot of mercury and laudanum and opium and things like that they might need for the aches and pains and illnesses that they were going to get along the way. And he also went and learned how to understand plants and animals and species and do scientific recording, because this was a scientific expedition. So he went and learned how to do that, and all that became very important. And then he went to Harper's Ferry, and they got armed with they got long rifles, which was the wilderness gun of the time. Right. It actually was invented in Pennsylvania, and then became very important to opening up the Shenandoah Valley. These long rifles.
For hunting mostly.
Mostly, well, yeah, absolutely for hunting.
Yeah.
And for also for if you had clashes with Native Americans, but for them it turned out to be important for shooting grizzlies and things like that.
Basically more powerful and more accurate.
Well, so it's the Pennsylvania long rifle. It's what opened up the frontier. That and the compass to survey land were the things that opened up America's frontier. So you needed certain skills to recruit. So they recruited a number of people. One of those 9 men from Kentucky was a guy named John Coulter. And John Coulter has Stewart Straff ties, probably Stewart Straff ties. The records aren't very good, and John Coulter didn't leave any records that we know of, but more than likely, John Coulter was born in Stewart Straff. There are some that dispute that, but he was probably born in Stewart Straff in the 1770s, and when his family was very young. And so thus we have the Coulter family. Certainly the Coulter family was here by the 1770s. And so Coulter Street in Stanton would have been some cousin who became a judge and hung around here. But there was an element of the Coulter family who didn't let grass grow under their feet, just like a lot of people who passed through the Shenandoah Valley. They moved on out west where they could have more land and more opportunity, and didn't really like too much civilization. So the Coulter family moved to Kentucky by most accounts, when John was just a few years old, and he grew up in Kentucky, learning the ways of being a backwoodsman. And so he was in Kentucky, and that's where he was recruited out of and signed up. But the house that the Coulter family lived in Stewart Straff is still there. All descriptions say that the Coulter house that was left was a rudimentary little rough cabin. Today, the John Coulter house is a nice early 19th century brick house. But the thought is that elements of that rough cabin are kind of encased in that.
Encased in the house, yeah. So there may be logs in the.
Yeah. So there's a central portion, that is much older. So anyway, so Coulter became one of the most important members of the expedition. He was always a private, but he was a scout, and he was a good hunter, and he was an excellent scout. Some people said that he could walk through the woods and you never hear him. So he could sneak up on you. He could track. He could tell not only what animal had made that track, but he could say that was made 3 hours ago, or that was made 2 days ago. So he was skilled as a backwoodsman, and he gets numerous mentions by Lewis and Clark for his skills, and sometimes he even saved their life hunting and being aware of things. So this expedition sets out. They start off by 1803. They're out in. Just trying to find my timeline here so I can get it right. So in the spring of 1803, that's when Lewis went up to Philadelphia, and then he went to Harper's Ferry and stocked up on things, including the buildings of boats, because they were going to remember, they were trying to find a water passage.
Right.
So they were going to go up the Missouri River as far as they could, and their hopes were that the Missouri River would then dump into the Pacific Ocean.
Have its own continental divide, yeah.
Right. But we know now that the Missouri River headwaters are in the Rockies, and then you got all the Rocky Mountains, and then you got other streams that are coming out of the Rockies and flowing west.
Right.
So they and when Clark was in Pittsburgh, he started recording in his journal. Both he and Lewis and Clark both. Lewis began recording in his journal when he was in Pittsburgh, but both of them kept extensive journals and notebooks of the things they saw and discovered. And there were a number of other people on the expedition who did as well. But John Coulter was told to keep one too, but he apparently did not, although we know that he was literate. So November of 1803, they go to Illinois, and they start training people, figuring out how to get organized. That we know that one of the things that was mentioned, learn how to use survey equipment and these mapping skills that they're trying to perfect. And the men there got a little rowdy. John Coulter got into trouble there with maybe some drinking and got hauled before Lewis and Clark, and he apologized, and he said, "Do you want to continue?" And he said yes. And so he mended his ways and went forward. But we know also one of the things that they did is they did fishing, and they recorded up in that area of Illinois, catching 128-pound catfish, which is pretty impressive. So, and then
that's a big fish. Yeah,
that is a big fish. So then they start off in 1804, in the spring of 1804, from just St. Charles, which is just a little bit outside of St. Louis. And the first entry in the journal was, "We proceeded on under a gentle breeze up the Missouri, May 14th, 1804. And that was the start of 28 months where they just pretty much dropped off the face of the earth and made their way west. They made their way all the way, and it was hard. I mean, this was a wilderness. They weren't the first white settlers, white explorers to go there, because the French had been in that area for a long time as trappers and scouts. And of course, the Native Americans had been there for 10,000 years. But they were really seeing things that no English and no people in the United States or England had seen before. And they were working their way up there. So as they worked up the Missouri River, they were going upstream. And, the Missouri River is a big, thick, muddy river. They said it's too, what do some people say? It's too thin to plow and too thick to float on. Yeah. So, I mean, and I've been on the Missouri, canoeing on the Missouri, and you have to get out on your canoe and pull it along.
So it's just sediment from the.
Yeah. It's just a lot of sediment.
Yeah.
And so some days they would only it took them like 3 weeks to go 18 miles at one point, where they had to take their boats out of the river and, portage around the falls and things like that. So it was at some point, as the headwaters kind of petered out into nothing, they abandoned their boats and sent them back east with whatever they had collected so far, which was still quite a bit. So they got as far as North Dakota with the Mandan Indians up there, and that's where they camped for the winter. And that's where they picked up a couple more scouts, mostly of French traders and trappers. And so they, and one of those traders and trappers, his name was, let's see, Toussaint Charbonneau. And he had a wife. He was in his 40s. He was a trapper. But he had a wife who was he had traded for her. She was a Native American who had been captured by the Shoshone, and she was 16 years old, and she was pregnant. And during that winter, she had a baby, and that baby was his wife was. There's different pronunciations. Some say Sacagawea, some say Sakakawea.
Yeah.
But Sacagawea was probably the most important person on this expedition because she was Native American and she spoke many Native tongues.
Okay.
And just the presence of her and her new baby as they were going west made a statement that these are not people looking to pick a fight. This is not a military expedition. This is a peaceful expedition. We have a woman on it. We have a baby on it. And so it settled the first encounters with the native tribes that Lewis and Clark and the expedition ran up against. And they bumped into at least 50 different groups of native peoples. And so there was a lot, and Sacagawea didn't know the tongues of all of them, but she knew a lot of them, or she knew something that an interpreter there could exchange for. So she was very helpful. And her baby, they ended up calling him Pompey was his nickname, and he caught the eye of Lewis and Clark, and he was the sort of the mascot of the expedition. They all loved him. And so the first North Dakota was where they wintered over. It was a hard winter. And they stayed there in a native village or across from the native village. And you can go up there and visit today if you want, Fort Mandan, which is pretty interesting visit if you venture up to North Dakota. So. Then come spring, they started west again, and so then
they took 4 months off basically, or 4.
Yeah, several months off. Yeah,
because it'd be colder up there, especially then.
Oh yeah, I mean, think about what winters are like in North Dakota. They're brutal. Yeah. So this was apparently a very brutal winter. So they made these earthen huts, and that's what they stayed in all winter. And they started off in the spring, heading west again, keeping going with their journey. And so very soon, of course, they got into the Rockies, and that became incredibly difficult and treacherous. And they relied upon guides that they'd meet along the way with different Indian tribes to help figure out how to get through it. And they ended up getting some horses from some of the native tribes there. Horses are not indigenous to North America, but the Spanish conquistadors had brought them into North America in the late 1500s. And so they had wild horses had spread all through the West, and the Native Americans had adapted them and were excellent, skilled horsemen, a lot of them. So they traded for some horses and, moved on west, made it to Oregon and saw the Pacific Ocean. And then it was time to winter again. And so they wintered that second winter in Fort Clatsop, on the Pacific Ocean. And then in March, they started coming back. And the way back was a lot easier. They knew the way. They ran into some guides who gave them some shortcuts. And guess what? They're going downstream. So
muddy, thick Missouri.
Yeah, but they could make, sometimes going back downstream, they made 70 miles a day.
Right.
And so they made it back in the fall of 1806. They made it back to St. Louis, and everybody had given up on them by that time. They figured they'd gone into the wilderness and that was it.
They were dead. Yeah.
They had no email, no telegraph, nothing like that.
Not even a cell phone. Not
even a cell phone. And so they were heroes, and they'd had a lot of injuries and illnesses and scrapes. Clark had gotten shot in the butt by one of the other members of the expedition. And gotten attacked by grizzlies. but the only death that they had was in Iowa as they were heading out. And Sergeant Floyd had died of a ruptured appendix.
So one person died in that whole journey?
In the whole journey of 28 months and, like, I don't know, 3,000 miles.
How many people were on
there were 33, I think, on
That's
it.
pretty amazing.
That's pretty amazing, including, of course, a baby and a woman, and there was also a slave. William Clark's slave named York was a valuable member of the expedition. He had been Clark's servant since Clark was a little boy, so they'd been raised together. But it was definitely master and slave. But York really gave them an in to a lot of the Native American peoples who had never seen a person with such dark skin before.
Okay.
And so he saved people's lives on multiple occasions. When they came back, that story is a little sad. When they came back, York asked Clark for his freedom, and Clark, for about 10 years, refused to give him his freedom for whatever reasons. And he eventually did grant him his freedom. So one of the most important members. And also, Clark had a Newfoundland dog whose name was Seaman. Like he was a navigator going to the ocean, so he was a seaman. And so he was also an important part of the expedition. So
Sacagawea, and did they come back or did they stay out there?
They stayed out, and so the scouts that were attached to them, and there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 scouts that were non-military members, and York was a non-military member. Okay. So the scouts didn't come all the way back. Everybody, and I don't know if those scouts got money and land, but all the other, and York did not, but all the others got money and land afterward as a reward for their service. But Coulter didn't come all the way back. A couple of them didn't come all the way back. A couple of them left. Coulter left when they got back to about Fort Mandan in the Dakotas. He was feeling the itch to go back and do some fur trapping. Beaver trapping was incredibly lucrative, and you could sell the furs in St. Louis and make a lot of money. So he got the itch to go on back, and so he asked if he could leave the expedition. And after some consultation and with the other members of the expedition, Lewis and Clark let him go back with the stipulation that they didn't want everybody just to start abandoning ship.
Right.
So the others, so he was one of the few that was allowed to leave early. And so he went back, and then he stepped into being famous to step into legend. And I don't know if you want to know a little bit about that, but he became, he slipped into legendary status with some things that happened. So this is 1806. He only lived 7 more years. Okay. But what he did in those 7 years was pretty incredible. So you want to know, right?
Yeah, I want to know.
You want to know what Coulter did. So Coulter went back and began fur trapping, and in his wanderings around, he wound up going to Yellowstone and Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and is apparently the first white person who witnessed those the geysers, the boiling and bubbling mud, the sulfur pots and things like that. And so he came back and described them to some people that he ran into. He never wrote anything down, but he described them to some people that he ran into, and they didn't believe him. They thought he was making it up. But they referred to it all as Coulter's Hill. And because it was like fire and brimstone, like it was supposedly like what hell is like, smells of sulfur, and it is, if you've ever been to Yellowstone, it is exactly like that. So it's called Coulter's Hill. There is pretty strong evidence that he was there and didn't make it up, and including back in the 1880s. So Coulter was doing this, in like 18 6, 7, 8.
Right.
And so in the 1880s, someone found in this area a tree that had a deep blaze on it. It was an X, and then it had a J and a C, and they cleared it off and looked, and they felt like it was, the age of it would have dated it back to John Coulter's time.
John Coulter.
And then somebody also found in the 1930s in a field in sort of the Wyoming, Idaho border area, which is where Yellowstone is.
Right.
They found a field with John Coulter's name, or a rock in the field that when they were plowing, they turned it up, and it had his name carved on the rock. And this was in the 1930s, and the farmers had no idea who John Coulter was, so
Right.
they didn't. So it's probably not a hoax, but it's probably what he did to pass the time when he wintered there. One winter, you're holed up with the snows and the cold and stuff. You just have to hunker down for a couple months, and so he was bored and maybe carved that rock. So he probably did, and then so. There were, as I said, there were 50 or 60 different types of cultures, Native American cultures that were out there, and they didn't all like each other, and they didn't all get along with these trappers that were intruding into their lands either. So he and another of the Lewis and Clark members who had left, John Potts, were trapping, and they ran into some Blackfeet Indians, and it was nasty. So one member of the Lewis and Clark expedition who died later out west, and then they had captured Coulter, and they'd stripped him naked, and were going to torture him. And what they did was they kind of teased him, gave him a couple 100-yard head start, and said, "You run, and then we'll catch. If you can outrun us, then you live. But if you can't outrun us, then we're going to catch you and torture you and kill you." And now remember, he's naked, and they had horses, and he was on foot, barefoot, in an area that has plenty of cactus. And so he took off, and they were so cocky that they said, "We're just going to wait for a while because we've got horses. We'll track him down." Well, he went in, and he ran and found water, and ran several miles, found some water, and there's varying accounts. One account says he found a big log jam in the river and got underneath it. More accounts say, and this makes a little bit more sense than a moving log jam, that he found a beaver house, not a beaver dam, but a beaver hut. And, beavers are mammals, so they breathe air. So to get to their huts, you go underwater, and then you come up, and then you're out in the air again. And so he got into that beaver hut and just hung out for a couple of days until and apparently he heard the natives looking for him, walking over top of the hut and everything, and he just stayed in there for a couple of days, and then he walked many more miles to the closest fort that was out there. So and he was beat up, he was starving, his feet were full of prickly pear cactus spines,
and he was naked.
And he was naked.
Yeah.
He was buck naked. So imagine the surprise at the fort when this naked man walks into the fort. But with that, surviving that, he becomes legend because a lot of people wrote about it. He hangs around out west for a couple more years, and he becomes what's called a mountain man. And they said he could outrun, outshoot anything that was around, which obviously he proved he could. And they said, even in the coldest winter, all he did was wrap himself up in a blanket and get into a hollow tree and stay there. He could endure the harshest conditions. So apparently he did tire of that. He winds up going back as far as Missouri, a little town in Missouri, and he marries a woman named Sally, who by some accounts was at least partially Native American.
Okay.
And he settles down there about 1810, 1811, something like that. And within 3 years, he's dead. He died of what was called jaundice, which is a liver disease. We don't know anything more than that, but he dies and passes from there he passes from this life to legend. And now if you go out west, you'll see Coulter National Forest or Coulter State Forest, Coulter Campground, Coulter. I mean, he's pretty big.
Where would that be? Where?
The Yellowstone area, Yellowstone and Jackson Hole area.
Okay.
So the Montana, Wyoming area.
Yeah, that's southwest corner.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it well. Jefferson River, Jackson River. Anyway,
Yep.
they're
And you know, there is a historic marker in Stewart's Draft now that talks about Coulter and the expedition. So he was linked back here, at least in modern times. There is one book that's a pretty good book about John Coulter. There's not a lot of written information about him, so it's hard to piece together. And this person poo-poos the idea that he came from Stewart's Draft. But a guy also misspelled Stewart's Draft in his book, so I poo-poo his idea. So there you go. But
I always wonder why there's not an apostrophe after the T, between the T and the S. Not that I'm.
Well, and he put the apostrophe in, and that's where I said he misspelled it. But
that's why he misspelled it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why is there no apostrophe?
Just because we've gone away from apostrophes. The same with Harper's Ferry or.
Okay. Because that should be apostrophe S too. Yeah.
Yeah, Greenville used to be called Greensville.
Okay.
Apostrophe S because it was named after Nathaniel Green, and
okay.
By the way, Stewart's Draft. Just to get into the weeds again, which we're prone to do.
Go ahead.
Stewart's Draft. So it was a Stewart family that lived there, and it's not a draft like it was breezy and windy, but draft is an old word for meaning water gushing out of a place. And so the South River is gushing out of there, and there's also a lot of springs that gush out of there. So it's a draft of water coming out of something. So that's how it got its name. So, and it only seems to be.
So it could have been mint draft instead of mint spring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But only in Augusta and Highland and Bath and Rockbridge, and then some places down in Tennessee and Kentucky, where you get all these Scotch-Irish people, do you find the word draft. And so it obviously is something that comes from Ulster area.
Okay.
It's an old-fashioned word for water gushing out of something. So because you've got Ramsay's draft.
Which is obviously water. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you've got lots of drafts in these areas instead of creek or river or stream. They called them drafts. And so
the best part about the show, Nancy, is somebody that listens to this show is going to say that to somebody, and they're going to look really smart. That's
yes.
like me, for example.
We're giving you party talk. So
party talk. This is the party talk show.
So you can become the life of the party, and everyone.
Yeah. Let's go up the valley.
Over there. But it's an older usage, an English word. For instance, there are some other little Ulster Scotch-Irish words that hang around in this area. If you go to some of the older farmers and you ask them about their sheep in the field, those are not ewes and rams. Those are bucks and ewes. And yo is just an old way to say EWE. If you remember.
Oh, it's the way you pronounce it. Okay. Yeah.
It's the way you pronounce it. In the Bible, if you go back to the King James Version, show is often spelled SHEWE, and we mispronounce it now if we're reading from King James and say shoe, but that's show.
Okay.
Show, yo, it's just an old spelling and an old pronunciation of EWE. But there are other things like these big fence staples that you put your fencing up with, these big wire staples.
Right.
They don't call them staples; they call them steeples.
Okay.
So there are words that kind of tie back to our heritage, and then the classic one. I didn't talk about this in cows. I should have, because this is a great one.
This is your big chance. This is episode 8.
This is episode 8, but going back, and referring back to an earlier episode, the hornless cow. Did I talk about hornless cows then? I don't think I did. A hornless cow is called a muley cow, and that became pretty widespread here. Muley, but you find it a lot in this area there's a stray records. There's an old Muley Cow, and I thought meant it was just ugly, but it's a Gaelic word for hornless.
Okay.
And so
So we're muley.
hornless. So we're born naturally hornless. So we're muley, I guess. Or moily. If you go to Ireland, there's actually a breed of hornless cattle called moiled cattle. So anyway, back to John Coulter. John Coulter wasn't the only Augusta County connection. So if you doubt him, there are a couple others. There were two blacksmiths, John Shields and William Bratton. And William Bratton actually was born in Augusta County, but it's now Rockingham County because Rockingham was cut out of Augusta County in 1778. So he was born before 1778 in Augusta County, that's now Rockingham County. And he was one of those men that had moved, families that had moved west to Kentucky, just like Abraham Lincoln's family.
Did he go with Lewis and Clark? Are you saying?
Oh, no. They had all moved earlier. Okay. And just like Abraham Lincoln's family moved from Rockingham County to Kentucky, everybody was moving west and going for more land and more opportunity. So, so the Brattons had moved west. And so he was one of those 9 that were recruited out of Kentucky. Those 9 that answered the advertisement for being, although he was married, so he broke the mold, but he was a blacksmith and he was a gunsmith, and those were.
Yeah, you got to have them.
You got to have them. I mean, they would repair all their tools, they would repair their guns, and they also would make trinkets that were traded with the Native Americans. Cool. So, and the other one was John Shields, and the Shields family is noted gunsmiths from Augusta County. Actually, the Shields, people as they went west into the frontier in the early 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, they were coming back to Stanton, which was on the edge of the frontier at this time, to get their guns. And John Shields had a little gun factory that was really where Henry Funeral Home is now, out on West Beverly. It was the Shields gun factory. So the Shields were noted long rifle makers. So and then so there were those who were on it, and then there are a couple other Augusta County connections. Both, of course, Thomas Jefferson has lots of connections. The inspiration of the expedition was Thomas Jefferson, and he has lots of connections with Augusta County. Maybe another talk, but he actually, the only place he ever practiced law was in the Augusta County courthouse. But Meriwether Lewis, had come here, but on the way back in 1806, they went all the way back to Washington, D.C. and were celebrated as heroes, entertained at the White House. And
got a McDonald's supper.
Yeah, I had a McDonald's supper, and there you go. But Lewis they knew they needed to restock and resupply, so he contacted some merchants in Stanton and restocked with several $100s worth of supplies there. And then the saddest connection of all came a couple years later, and so Lewis and Clark went on. They were national heroes. Lewis was appointed as governor of the new Louisiana Territory, and Clark went out to St. Louis and became like a head of Indian affairs out there. So pretty big posts, political appointees, both of them. And Meriwether Lewis apparently struggled with alcoholism and some depression at times. We don't know a lot of details about that, but he met an untimely death in 1809, October of 1809, out on the Natchez Trace, which is kind of a really rough road. You could, down in the Louisiana Territory, sort of Tennessee area. He was, some people say he committed suicide, but the circumstances of his death have always been questioned. How he could kill himself. He shot himself, or he was shot, and the wounds were such that left in doubt that they could have actually been self-inflicted. But so there are always rumors of things, but he also perhaps got into some shady activity happening. This was wild. This was the wild, wild west. And there were controversies about Mobile, Alabama, and New Orleans, and still some disputed territories down there. So it unfortunately in October, his body was found. He was staying at a tavern, and his body was found. So this was like way outside of civilization. So a man was there who witnessed that. He knew this was big stuff. So he gets on a stagecoach, and he hightails it back to the east so he can be the first one to report this. And he gets to, finally his stagecoach arrives at where he thinks he's now in civilization. And where that was is Stanton, Virginia.
Really?
So he gets to Stanton. He gets off the stagecoach. He marches to the newspaper in Stanton, which was the Republican Farmer. That was the name of the newspaper in Stanton at that time, the Republican Farmer. He marches right to the newspaper office, and he reports that, one of the country's most famous people has met an untimely death. Republican Farmer prints it up, and it gets sent out by wire, which is not by wire. It gets printed. And then all the other newspapers at that time, they would just steal from one paper for another. So the Richmond newspaper picks it up. Then it goes to the Philadelphia, and it gets all over the country. But the breaking news was in Stanton, Virginia, of
once again,
and of Lewis's sad death. And then so the word goes out, and so then Clark comes back from the west, his west post, and he actually came back and had married a woman from Botetourt County, who her name was Julie Hickok, but he had an interest in her before he left on the expedition. He apparently couldn't remember her name. So when he got out in Montana area, he named one of the streams out there Judy's Creek, and it actually should have been Julie's Creek. But he came back and married her, I guess, figured out her real name. And so he had come back east to get married and be with his family. And then from Botetourt County, which is south of Rockbridge,
sure.
He decided that he was going to come north in the Shenandoah Valley to talk to Meriwether Lewis's mother and to Thomas Jefferson and give them the details that he knew about of Lewis's death. Plus, he had to go up to Philadelphia. Both Lewis and Clark had been dealing with publishers in Philadelphia to get their journals published, and they got a lot of them published, but not all of them. So he makes his way, and he keeps a little journal, recording his expenses and everything. And he gets to Lexington, and he spends a night in Lexington, and he records how much that was. And then the next night he gets to Greenville, and he pays some fees in Greenville, probably a toll on the Valley Pike. And he gets to Stanton, and then he heads over and delivers the news. So that's just another connection. And of course,
got on 64 and popped over Afton Mountain.
Yeah. And of course, Albemarle County has a ton of Lewis and Clark connections. So there is a move to make. So there's a National Park Service has a Lewis and Clark legacy trail that goes basically from St. Charles, Missouri, all the way to Fort Clatsop and back. And on the way back, they did a lot of side expeditions where they split up, and Lewis would take one group and Clark would take one group. Like near Billings, Montana, there's a big rock that sticks way up. It's called Pompey's Pillar, and Clark and a couple of his guys climbed up the pillar and carved their names on it. Well, it's W. Clark, and it has the date. And now it's a national landmark, and you can climb up it and you can see Clark's signature on it, and you better not put your own signature on it because you're going to go to jail. So yes, so only Clark can deface
Clark's, yeah, and he can't do it. He can't do it anymore, as far as we know.
Yes, and so and they named it Pompey's Pillar after, of course, Pompey the baby. Unless
Pompey is still alive.
Yes, and so so for the last 15 years or so, there's been a move with the Park Service to connect and do an Eastern Legacy Trail that would be Kentucky, that would come up through the valley and mark those things, Botetourt and Rockbridge and Augusta and Albemarle County. And in fact, Virginia now, about 5 years ago, Virginia we are part of the Eastern Legacy Trail, and then it goes up to Philadelphia and Harper's Ferry and makes those connections too. But the Virginia Assembly passed a resolution making us part of the Eastern Legacy Trail. It's still sitting around in Congress. Congress has had a few other things to worry about, so they haven't passed it. But just to kind of sum up what this expedition did, they discovered, it certainly was the core of discovery. They discovered like hundreds of animals and plants that had never been documented before. They were the first men to record a grizzly bear.
Really? Okay.
Really, and also a prairie dog. They actually captured a prairie dog and sent it home to Jefferson. And something like almost 200 plants. They collected plants and they pressed them, and a lot of those are still up in Philadelphia in herbariums now. But plants that we didn't even know about, and so it truly was a core of discovery, a scientific expedition. America's first scientific expedition.
So, well, Nancy, this was an adventure.
Yes, there's a lot of discovery.
So, anyway, so this may end up being 2 episodes. We don't know yet until I get to the editing room.
I get too long-winded, I guess.
That's all right. No, you're full of knowledge anyway. So, once again, we're looking for sponsors. You can sponsor us for $25 a show, or 6 shows if we do 6 more shows. But you get in touch with Nancy at the email below. And once again, this is Footnotes in Valley History. I'm Richard Adams, and there's your expert, Nancy Sarles. And thank you for listening and watching.
Thank you.
So I'm going to leave it
Make sure to use some of these facts at your next party when you're allowed to go out and socialize again.
Right.